Let me hand over to Allan for the last lecture of the day.
Can everyone hear me? I do very much understand that I'm standing between all of you and some nice drinks and cocktails and snacks. So I'll try to keep it interesting and try to keep it exciting. It's a real honor to be able to present here. When Ivan asked me to give a lecture, he said, talk about housing and finance, which is a sufficiently broad topic, so I think I took some liberties here. And this is, sort of really just showcasing some of the work I've been doing over the last few years, but also some of the content I've been teaching here in the economics department at UCT. So in my mind, when I think about this link between housing and finance, I really want to try to zoom into this idea of housing as an asset and housing as a financial asset. So if we think about housing as an asset, and here you can contrast this with things like bonds, contrast this with things like stocks. In my opinion, housing is arguably the most unique and single most important asset class that exists. And I'll argue that this is due to the fact that housing has three key features, and that these three features are in a sense amplified by the fact that housing has a spatial dimension too. So housing is firstly a consumption good. So what do I mean by this? You consume housing in the sense that you live in a house, and houses have different characteristics, and people are able to sort of choose over these set of characteristics to pick the house that they ultimately want to live in. So in a very basic sense, housing provides shelter. I'm going to then touch on this idea of housing displacement. So we speak about all these benefits to what happens when you have a home. But I think a natural question is, well, what happens when you lose a home? And we'll sort of look at the literature on evictions and foreclosures. But then I also want to highlight the role of neighborhoods. So the idea is that the house that you live in doesn't exist in a vacuum. The house that you live in exists in a neighborhood, and those neighborhoods convey or provide households with a lot of benefits as well. In addition to being a consumption good, housing is also an asset. So here we're going to focus specifically on the role of housing as a major source of wealth. So if you look across developed and developing countries globally, housing is typically the single largest asset households will ever own. And because of that, housing is going to have a really important role to play with respect to wealth inequality. And that's obviously going to be very important in high inequality settings like South Africa and the rest of the continent. And because housing plays such an important role in terms of households' wealth and in terms of the household portfolio, the fact that different households are going to be able to earn different returns and make different capital gains in the market is also going to be an additional wedge for wealth inequality. So here the idea is that sort of we're maybe all not equally skilled in the housing market. So some of us may make big returns, some of us may make small returns. I may buy a house in Cape Town that for 20 years experiences really high property price growth. You may buy a house in another part of the country for exactly the same price that experiences negative growth. And all of these sort of price trends are going to have implications for wealth inequality as well. And then finally, I want to focus on this idea that housing, and specifically mortgages, which are the financial instrument used to purchase housing, is a liability too. So you can think of a mortgage or a bond as being the single largest liability that most households will ever own. So if you sort of spoke to your parents and you asked them, what is the largest asset you own? They'll say their house. And if you ask them, what is the largest liability you have? They'll say it's their mortgage. But in addition to that, mortgages at an aggregate level and the interaction of sort of mortgages with the financial system are also going to bring with it a range of financial stability concerns. We'll then also touch a bit on this idea of sort of access to housing finance. So if most households require a mortgage to be able to buy a house, but all households can't necessarily access mortgage markets in the same way, that is again going to have major implications for wealth inequality, given the importance of housing with respect to household portfolios. So all in all, the sort of main takeaway that I hope all of you leave with at the end of this presentation is that housing markets are central to our understanding of inequality. And if you want to better understand inequality and we want to better understand how to address inequality, I think understanding housing markets has a really important role to play. So the outline for this talk is going to be me sort of speaking a bit on sort of these three aspects of housing: consumption, asset, and liability, and then tying that together at the end. And by the way, if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to ask as I go along. So in the first feature of housing, the fact that housing is a consumption good. So unsurprisingly, housing is the single largest consumption item for households. So what I'm showing you here is a figure that shows you housing's share with respect to total household consumption. And I'm showing it to you in the green bars, all OECD countries, and in the orange bars for South Africa. That's taken from the Income and Expenditure Survey by Stats SA. And what you can see sort of in both contexts there is that housing is a fairly large share of all household consumption. So in OECD countries, you see this declining pattern with respect to income quintiles. So in the bottom income quintile over there, around 37% of all household consumption, household expenditure, is housing costs. That does drop by the top quintile, but you see in South Africa that it's relatively consistent across the sort of income distribution there. In other words, around 1/3 of household consumption goes to housing and other housing related costs. So in that sense, sort of everyone needs a house. You can think of a sort of house providing shelter as a very basic need. And I really like this quote first up, which is from the philosopher Allan who writes in The Architecture of Happiness that we don't just need a home in the sort of physical sense, but we also need a home in the psychological sense to compensate for a vulnerability. And I really like this sort of view of housing, that as much as this is a set of walls and a roof that provides us with sort of physical shelter, it does in a sense also provide us with psychological shelter as well. So if you think of having a horrible day at work, the first thing you want to do is get home, pour yourself a glass of wine if you're that way inclined, and lay on the couch and just take a deep breath, right? So a house is more than a shelter, but it in a sense bestows some psychological benefits as well. So unsurprisingly then, a major concern over the last sort of 20 to 30 years in the literature has been the lack of adequate housing, and especially the lack of adequate housing in the global south. So here I'm focusing specifically on South Africa, where I think there's sort of a large history of a lack of adequate housing. And around 1994, which is the point of the transition from apartheid, only around 65% of households in South Africa actually lived in a formal residential structure, right? So around 1/3 of the population around 1994 were living in informal residential structures. And by 1999, what we're going to call the housing backlog, which is the amount of homes that need to be built to ensure that every household in the country lives in a formal residential structure, was estimated to be around 3 to 3.7 million homes, right? So a sort of sizable housing challenge to be addressed. Unsurprisingly then, you see major policy responses to try to address these housing shortages. Here again, I'm focusing on South Africa, so focusing on our RDP or BNG program, which is effectively state-sponsored housing. So you can think of this effectively as a wealth transfer from the government to individuals. If your income is below a certain threshold in South Africa, you are eligible to receive a house from the state. And by 2025, the South African government had provided around 3 million homes to households in South Africa. So again, by 2025, around 3 million homes were provided in South Africa alone, and this sort of goes to trying to address this housing challenge around 1994. But still, most recent estimates will show you that there is still an estimated housing gap, in a sense, or a housing backlog of around 2.2 million units. So despite major strides being made, there's still a gap that needs to be filled. So I've sort of just spoken about sort of this idea of a formal home. On this slide, I want to sort of try to speak to some of the benefits identified in the literature to formalized housing. And here's a few papers that I'll speak to over the next few slides. But the first one here shows that, and this comes from an intervention in Mexico, that shows that the move from informal to formal housing leads to a number of positive benefits to households. The ones I sort of want to focus here is this idea of improved health outcomes and cognitive development for children and improved welfare for adults. I think this result of improved cognitive development for children is a very important one, and a lot of the evidence I'm going to try to show you over the next few slides is going to speak to these long-term benefits of housing, right? So we obviously know if you have a formal structure over your head, you're sheltered from the elements, but I think that there are really important long-term benefits to for children residing in formal residential structures, which I'll try to speak to over the next few slides. In addition to all the benefits that maybe come from just living in a house, there are also important labor market effects. So this is some work from Simon Franklin, who studies this RDP, or government state-sponsored housing program in South Africa. And he finds that recipients of these state-sponsored houses in South Africa sort of see an increase in household income of around 18% after receipt of that state-sponsored house. And that effect is concentrated almost exclusively amongst women. And the sort of mechanism at play here is a similar one to the one that Taryn Dinkelman speaks about in her paper, where she shows that providing households with electricity in South Africa increases female labor supply earnings. And it's this idea that informality places a disproportionate burden on women, right? So if you're living in an informal structure and you're cooking with gas and you have to do child work and homework, living in an informal structure means that those activities take a lot longer, which means that there's very little time left over to enter the labor market. So what Simon finds in this paper here is that a large sort of benefit associated with these government-sponsored housing programs is that it actually reduces the burden placed on women with respect to work at home, and that frees up their time to enter the labor market. But a really important lesson that's come out in the literature, and again specifically focused on South Africa, that it's not just enough to provide people with houses, but it's also important with respect to where those houses are located, right? So location matters. So this is another piece of work by Natalie Picarelli here, who again studies this RDP program in South Africa, whereas Simon focused on this specifically in Cape Town. Natalie looks at this throughout the whole of South Africa, and she finds results that look slightly differently. Namely that 2 to 4 years after receiving a state-sponsored house, she actually finds evidence of a drop in labor supply for recipients. And this is quantitatively quite large. So recipients of RDP houses sort of experience a decline of 30 fewer hours per week with respect to paid labor, which is the equivalent to losing one member of your household with respect to the labor force, right? So fairly significant drop in receiving in labor supply and in earnings. And the mechanism behind this is that for RDP recipients, the distance that they live with respect to the CBD, where a lot of the job opportunities are located, increases by around 12 to 13 kilometers after receipt of the house. So they're living in informality, but they're living in informality close to economic opportunities. And then they're sort of given the state-sponsored house, which is sort of formalized housing, all these wonderful benefits. But this housing is located sort of 12 to 13 kilometers outside or further from the CBD. And importantly, if you look at these recipients, there is little to no change in their monthly spend on transport, which means that, they're moving 12 to 13 kilometers further, but they're not increasing their sort of monthly spends on transport, i.e. they're not commuting to the CBD, right? Their transport costs stay fixed. So many of these individuals actually lose access to jobs in the CBD, and Natalie argues that that is the mechanism that leads to a decrease in labor supply. And this highlights sort of a major challenge that you're going to see specifically in South Africa, but I think in many other countries where there is a significant housing backlog. And it's this idea that there's the spatial mismatch between where you live and where you work, right? And this is driven in many cases by the fact that governments in the provision of social housing are resource constrained, and land prices are cheapest further from where economic opportunities are. So if you have to provide housing at scale, and we're talking about building 4 to 5 million houses over a 20 to 25 year period, and you need to, in some cases, buy the land to be able to do that, or justify that the opportunity cost of using that land is sufficiently low to make it economically feasible, you can quite clearly understand how you sort of end up in this scenario where you're providing homes, but these homes aren't necessarily in locations that mean households can easily access economic opportunity. So I really like sort of this paper that some people at the World Bank put out, but I love the title on this: Shelter from the Storm, but Disconnected from Jobs. And I think this is where we tend to be in South Africa at the moment, that we sort of maybe in a sense solved the primary dilemma with respect to housing policy, which is putting a roof over people's heads. But we've not necessarily done that in a way that means that sort of people have access to economic opportunities. So on the last few slides, I spoke about sort of all of these benefits to formalized housing, but I think one part of the academic literature that does not receive as much attention as the literature on receiving a house is what happens to you when you lose a house, or when you lose your home, when you're evicted out of your home. And as you would expect, in the same way that sort of moving to formalized housing or becoming a homeowner has many positive benefits, losing one's home has many negative benefits. And I tried in one slide here to summarize a lot of the papers in the literature. The first example here is with respect to home foreclosure. So what do I mean here? You are a homeowner, you're paying off a mortgage, you default on the mortgage, the bank repossesses the home, evicts you, and the bank resells that home, typically at a foreclosure auction. So when this happens to individuals and they lose their home because they've been unable to keep up with their mortgage repayments, these households suffer housing instability, reduced home ownership rates into the future, increased financial distress. They end up moving to worse neighborhoods, and they experience elevated risk of divorce. That is work from Rebecca Diamond and co-authors. They also experience some negative health effects, and sort of this paper finds that there's actually more visits to the hospital following foreclosure. There's sort of this credit rationing channel that these homeowners default on their home loan. Financial institutions see that as a signal of them not being credit worthy, and then as a result of that, they're sort of essentially shuttled from receiving additional credit. And there's also sort of this idea of households being stuck in these debt traps. So when these homes are foreclosed, the typical procedure is these foreclosed homes get sold at an auction. And in many cases, and this is a fact that holds in many countries in the world, the prices that these homes sell for at an auction are sort of sufficiently low with respect to what it would have actually attained in the private market. So some of my own research in Cape Town shows that these foreclosed homes sell for around 30 to 40% lower than actual market prices. Now, this is problematic in jurisdictions where mortgages represent a recourse system. So what do I mean by a recourse system? In the United States, for example, if you went bankrupt, you were unable to pay your mortgage, you simply give in the keys, declare bankruptcy, and that debt is expunged. In countries like South Africa and many other jurisdictions, mortgages represent recourse loans, which means that if you have an outstanding debt of 1 million rand, the bank sells your home for 700,000 rand, you have lost your home, but you're still liable to repay the bank 300,000 rand. Right? You're still liable for that shortfall. South Africa works in this way. Many countries in Europe work in this way. I think around 20% of states in the US are also recourse states, right? So you can imagine a homeowner not only losing their home, but now still being forced to repay a portion of a mortgage for a home that they no longer own, right? So a lot of negative effects here. A category of sort of home displacement that receives arguably even less attention is this idea of evictions. Now, what is an eviction? You are renting a property, you've not met your monthly repayments, and the landlord evicts you from a property. These are actually staggeringly large in magnitude. So in the US, there are around 2 million evictions that happen every year. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of good data for other parts of the world, but when you are evicted from your home, again, the literature shows here that increased likelihood of homelessness, hospital visits, reduced earnings, reduced consumption, reduced access to credit, more indebtedness, reduces credit scores. And there's particularly bad effects for children as well. So sort of these evictions lead to sort of disrupt school engagement. And you actually see that children that were subject to a home eviction have lower high school graduation rates. And if you're interested in sort of thinking and reading about evictions, I want to recommend 2 books here. The first by Matthew Desmond, who's one of the leading sociologists in the world. who has this book called Evicted, which follows 8 families as they sort of bounce between housing in the US and sort of are evicted and move on to the next one, evicted. And Invisible Child by Andrea Elliott, who focuses on one girl and her family, Dasani, and sort of documents their journey over around a 10-year period, sort of being evicted and sort of moving to different houses. Both of these books won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction, so highly recommended. So we've spoken about all the benefits to sort of having a home, sort of having a formalized structure. We then spoke about all of the negative effects with losing one's home. And to sort of end off the section, I just want to touch quite briefly on this idea of a neighborhood. So where you grow up matters, right? So it's not just that you have a home, that home exists in a neighborhood, and that neighborhood is going to bestow or sort of convey or provide certain benefits. And a clear way to illustrate this is through this figure here, which is the Opportunity Atlas. So this is from a series of papers from Nathaniel Hendren and Raj Chetty. So what this figure is showing you is household income at age 35 for children that grew up in these or in different parts of the US. So I'll explain how to interpret this. Areas that are red, sort of low income, areas that are blue, high income. So I think what's that over there? That's $25,000. So household income for individuals at age 35 who were born in this area of the US was sort of less than $25,000. But in adulthood, for children that were born in the North here, incomes are significantly higher, right? So where you are born is a very clear predictor of the income you are likely to earn when you are an adult, right? So again, crystallizing this idea, where you grow up matters. So in a series of papers, some of you are probably very familiar with this. Raj Chetty, Nathaniel Hendren, and Lawrence Katz have a look at this moving to opportunity experiment, which I think is sort of the clearest illustration of these neighborhood effects. So what is the moving to opportunity experiment? It was effectively a randomized housing mobility experiment in the 1990s, conducted for around 4,500 families in 5 US cities. And these families and households were essentially provided a sort of housing voucher that required them to move to a specific subset of cities in the US, and those a subset of cities were low poverty cities. So you were given this housing voucher and you were told you could exchange that in return for housing in one of these groups of cities in the US that are all low poverty. So they were trying to move households and families from high poverty neighborhoods to low poverty neighborhoods. And the real innovation here, which I think sort of highlights where I think the cutting edge of a lot of academic research in economics is at the moment, is that Chetty Hendren were able to link information on who these participants were to administrative tax records for the US. So they looked at all the families that received these vouchers. They sort of looked at, in a sense, the social security number of the kids. They waited 35 years, found that social security number in the administrative tax data in the US, and had a look at sort of what the incomes of those kids were in adulthood, and compared them to the incomes of kids that grew up in the same area 35 years later who didn't have the benefit of moving. Right? So take 2 identical families, you give one the opportunity to move, and one stays in place, and then track the incomes of those children 35 years later. And what they find is a significantly large effect of this intervention. So to just explain here what a Section 8 voucher is. So a Section 8 voucher is, again, a housing voucher in the US that's provided to families living in high poverty neighborhoods, but there's no restriction as to where that voucher can be exchanged. So you could move to another high poverty neighborhood. The sort of moving to opportunity of a voucher differed in that it mandated that you move to a low poverty neighborhood. And what you see over here is that when you have a look at the children that moved and you look at their incomes in adulthood, the children that moved to these low poverty neighborhoods had 31% higher incomes than the children in the control group who stayed put in the same area. Right? So again, you are able to take one family out of poverty and put them into a neighborhood that is much lower poverty, and you'll see that in adulthood, those kids grow up to have much higher levels of income. But the authors also highlight this really, I think, novel effect with respect to what they call exposure duration. So it turns out that the earlier you move kids, the bigger the effects, right? And if you sort of move a kid around the age of, you can sort of see over here, around the age of like 20 or so, those positive benefits effectively go away. So the earlier you're able to sort of have this child move to a low poverty neighborhood, the bigger the effects with respect to income. So how you should be reading this graph over here, you could think of 0% here as the income at the origin, so in the sort of high poverty neighborhood. 100% would be complete parity with the income in the destination neighborhood. So this is the low poverty neighborhood. And how you would interpret this is that children that moved at age 8 had an income in adulthood that was around 60% the income they would have had if they lived their entire lives in the low poverty neighborhood. So again, very sizable effects. A secondary result here is that not all neighborhoods convey the same set of benefits as well. So what you're seeing here is the effect on earnings with respect to every year of a child growing up in that area for the sort of 10, in a sense, best or sort of highest earnings area of the US. So if you move to Page, Illinois, that would be for every year of exposure for a child, their anticipated increase in earnings in adulthood, but you can see that there are obviously some parts in the US that have a negative effect as well, right? So not all neighborhoods are going to be the same. So to close off that section on housing as a consumption good, it conveys a lot of positive benefits being able to live in formalized housing. When households and individuals lose access to formalized housing, there are many negative effects. And then finally, housing doesn't exist in a vacuum. The neighborhood in which a home exists also bestows and conveys a lot of important benefits to households. So turning now from housing as a consumption good to this idea that a house is an asset as well. So if you look globally, Thomas Piketty tells us that around housing accounts for roughly 50% of total national wealth. Some research in the OECD shows that housing accounts for 50% of total household assets in OECD countries, and some work by Morris, Davids, and Stein van Nieuwenburg showing the US that between 1950 and 2013, 35% of total assets in the US are made up of housing, 40% of net worth in the US is made up of housing wealth, and for homeowners under the age of 40, housing constitutes 90% of their total asset portfolio, right? So it's quite clear here to see that housing represents the single largest asset for household. And what we're going to try to unpack through the next few slides is what is this going to tell us about housing's role with respect to wealth inequality. So again, Morris Davids and Stein van Nieuwenburg write in a really great survey paper on housing and the macroeconomy that housing acts as a gatekeeper to wealth accumulation, right? So if housing is this really important asset, housing appreciates in price over the medium term. So if you are able to have a house in your portfolio, that asset is going to grow over time and you're going to accumulate wealth. And you can see that if you look at sort of the survey for consumer finances in the US, you'll see that at every single age, homeowners have dramatically higher net worth than renters. And the reason for that is because they have housing in their portfolio. In addition to that, housing is also a sort of major mechanism for thinking about intergenerational wealth transfer. Some recent work by Matteo Benetton and co-authors shows that there is the significant positive correlation between home ownership rates of children and their parents. Put differently, if your parents owned a home, you are very likely to be a homeowner. If your parents did not own a home, you are much less likely to be a homeowner as well. So what are the or what are the sort of mechanisms or the channels through which housing sort of affects intergenerational wealth transfer? I can think of two. The first is this idea of sort of housing as a bequest, or sort of housing as an inheritance. And sort of this is a paper looking at OECD data, and they find that in OECD countries, 20% of households either inherited their house outright or received it as a gift from their parents. Right? Again, 1 out of 5 households receive their house as an inheritance, as a bequest, or they receive it as a gift. And the second sort of channel for this intergenerational wealth transfer is the idea that sort of parents help children put deposits down when they buy a house. And in some cases, they sort of they buy houses outright and provide their kids with zero interest loans or very low interest loans. So over here, I'd highly recommend a book by Eliza Fulby called Inheritocracy, where she coins this term, the bank of mom and dad. And she finds out that if you look in the UK, the bank of mom and dad is actually a top 10 mortgage lender. So if you look through sort of deeds data in the US and you see who provided the mortgage, you tally this up across all banks, mom and dad is going to be in the top 10. And secondly, Matteo Benetton and co-authors here focuses on the US, and they sort of coined this term dynastic home equity. And they show that sort of when you look at in the data at the US, and you sort of are able to link parents to children, what you will often see in the data is right before a child buys a house, you see an equity extraction in the months before that by their parents. So what is an equity extraction here? I've paid down most of my home loan, that home is appreciated, and I can now sort of lend against my property as collateral. So the channel here is sort of parents own home, a kid needs to buy a home, they sort of borrow sort of against the property they already have, give that as a deposit to the child as well. Right? So it's not just that sort of housing is going to be important for thinking about wealth inequality now, but through this ability to bequest, or through this ability of sort of accessing the bank of mom and dad, housing is also going to have a really important role with respect to intergenerational wealth dynamics. Housing is, I would say, arguably more important as an asset when we focus on emerging markets relative to developed counterparts. So this is a survey paper by Tarun Ramadara and co-authors in the annual review of financial economics. And what they're showing you here, a figure on the left, is a view of household balance sheets for all the developed countries and household balance sheets in a set of emerging market countries there. And what you're going to see that the blue bars which show real estate here, in sort of almost exclusively all emerging markets, household balance sheets have a higher share of real estate. And unsurprisingly, you'll also see that there's a sort of really small share of financial assets. So sort of everything that we know about housing being an important asset is even more pronounced in developed and emerging market countries. Figure on the right shows you the figure on the left, broken up by terciles of wealth. So you can think of the third bar here being the sort of top third of the wealth distribution, the bottom bar being the bottom third of the wealth distribution. And you can see in every single tercile, housing is larger with respect to household balance sheets than it is in the developed countries. So housing is important. It's an important asset. It's even more of an important asset in emerging market economies. So again, we've sort of spoken about this idea of sort of housing and inequality. If we try to zoom out and look at this at an aggregate level, you see this link play out in macro data as well. So over here, I'm showing you a scatter plot for a range of OECD countries. On the x-axis, I'm showing you home ownership rates. And on the y-axis, I'm showing you the share of wealth held by the top 10% of the wealth distribution. So as we go up, on the y-axis, we sort of have an increasingly unequal society. And what you see here is sort of quite clear in the data that the higher home ownership rates a country has, the lower the extent of inequality, right? Which again is unsurprising when you consider how important housing is to household balance sheets, right? So if we're thinking about sort of what matters for inequality and how we address inequality, I argue that sort of housing has to be key to understanding that. And then sort of we've up to now really been looking at a a sort of stock of wealth. But obviously, sort of a house and any asset is a dynamic asset that earns a return. It appreciates and depreciates, such that if households are able to make different returns in the housing market, and some households are able to have higher rates of appreciation than others, that naturally means that these differences in stocks will just become wider with respect to flows as well. And that's something we'll unpack over the next few slides as well. Housing also creates these wealth inequality disparities across space. So spatially, over here I'm showing you a graph that has been all over the news for the last year if you've been living in South Africa. But it's showing you effectively a real index to 2010, real residential property prices in all of the major cities in South Africa. And what you'll see here is this major outlier that since 2013, Cape Town is the only city in the country that has been experiencing positive real property price appreciation. So what does this mean for wealth inequality? Take two people who both bought a R1 million home, that both bought that home in 2010. Everything else is identical. One bought that home in Cape Town, one bought that home in Johannesburg. That R1 million home would be worth 1.2 million rand for the person that bought it in Cape Town, but that same R1 million home would be worth 900,000 rand for the person that bought it in Johannesburg. So let's say at 2010, the stock of wealth for all of those individuals were identical. Differences in property price appreciation across space creates an additional wedge that drives sort of wealth inequality even further. So we need to not just sort of think about sort of these wealth trends in the aggregate, but also think about how differing returns across space may affect the wealth distribution as well. And not just differing returns across space, but the idea that different people are likely to make different returns with respect to housing. So this is by a really fantastic paper by Paul Goldsmith-Pinkham and Kelly Shue. There was a paper of the year in the Journal of Finance in 2023, where they study the gender gap in housing returns. So they're asking, do men and women make different returns when they sell their house? And they find that that indeed is the case. So on aggregate year, they find that when selling their house, men tend to make a 1.5 percentage point higher annualized return than women do. And they sort of show a lot of evidence that this relates to bargaining, how sort of men and women will differentially pair with different mortgage providers that have different sort of interest rate margins. And you can see that these return gaps by gender hold through the sort of property price distribution as well. So these return gaps are highest for high value properties. And I think this is the bit that really stood out and was quite striking from the paper. They think about what these differences in returns imply for wealth inequality, and they find that the gender differences in returns experienced when selling homes can explain around 30% of the gender gap in wealth accumulation in the United States. Right? So again, the differences that men and women make when they sell homes explains 30% of the gender gap with respect to wealth inequality in the United States. Right? So again, it's not just about the stock of differences in the stock of wealth, but it's also differences in the ability to generate a return or a capital gain on that stock. So in a sense, wealth inequality and how it's impacted by housing here is going to be a dynamic too. Okay, so we spoke about housing as an asset. It's a very large asset. It's a very important asset. It's disproportionately more important in emerging markets. As a result of this, housing is going to be a key component of understanding wealth inequality, and not just sort of wealth inequality in the cross-section, but if you think about the idea that different people, either through buying houses in different parts of the country or by having different sets of ability with respect to generating returns, that has the potential to drive a further wedge sort of across the time dimension of wealth inequality as well. So the sort of final aspect that I want to focus on is this idea of sort of housing, or sort of specifically mortgages, as being a liability and being the largest liability that most homeowners will ever have. So unsurprisingly, most people need a mortgage to buy a home. So some of my own work here shows that in Cape Town, around 64% of homeowners buy their home using a mortgage. In the United States, that number is around 70%. And a mortgage is going to be the largest liability that most households will ever have. So what I'm showing you here is data for all of the OECD countries. What you see in the blue bar here is the aggregate share of total mortgage debt with respect to total household debt in that country. And you see that these numbers sort of range from, let's say, there's a bit of an outlier with Korea there, but for the most part, they're 50% and up. What you're seeing on the black dot there is conditional on a household having a mortgage. How big is that mortgage with respect to all of their household debt? And you can see that at that intensive margin, that number is a lot higher, right? So conditional on having a mortgage is going to be more than 75% of that household's debt. So the house is going to be the largest asset, and the mortgage underlying that house is going to be the largest liability. And sort of unsurprisingly then, mortgages are a really key financial instrument. And they're actually one of the oldest financial instruments we have. So the sort of word mortgage comes from the Latin, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it, the French word, but it effectively translates to death pledge. That's the meaning of mortgage, which is you pay this for the duration, 20 years of the agreement. Upon the death of that, the pledge to repay ends. And these mortgages can be traced back all the way to the Tang dynasty, so around 600 AD, you see the first versions of these mortgages actually originate. So they're one of the oldest financial products we have. They're systemically large, and they're systemically large not just for households, but for the financial institutions that originate them as well. So in South Africa, mortgages make up 25% of the asset base of all banks in South Africa. Right? So you can see why concerns about sort of mortgage default rates rising sort of get regulators concerned, because mortgages represent a significant part of what banks call assets across the world. So mortgages are going to be important with respect to sort of our story here for two reasons. One, they provide financing for home purchases. So most of us simply don't have the capital saved up to be able to buy a home cash. And secondly, as a result of that, they're going to facilitate wealth building through this idea of leverage. So I can sort of put down a, let's say, 100,000 Rand deposit to buy a 2 million Rand home. I can get that money from the bank. I can pay that off over the course of a lifetime. Once I've paid that off, I'm able to then sort of experience these increases in property prices. But I think an important thing that I want to emphasize here is that mortgage can be a systemic financial stability risk. And this is a lesson that we learned the hard way in the financial crisis. So we can't talk about mortgages without briefly talking about the financial crisis. So I'll try to get this over with in 120 seconds. So we spoke about this imperative to provide housing. Right? So one idea here is that the government can build housing and sort of just transfer the wealth. The other idea is, well, we need to increase access to the mortgage market. But if mortgages are unprofitable for banks, or interest rates are very low in the cycle, such that banks can't make a high return, how do you incentivize banks to give out mortgages to address the housing supply shortage? And the idea that policymakers in the US and many countries had was this idea of mortgage securitization. So if any of you are familiar with like Finance 101, this idea of sort of like diversifying your risk. If you had a portfolio of, or let's say I bought one stock, that stock has a certain expected return, also has an expected risk. If I pool that stock with many other stocks, I'm actually able to achieve a portfolio that gives me a higher return and a lower risk, right? And you can do that through complex financial mathematics. The same idea was true with mortgages as well. So the US started these GSEs. In South Africa, we call them state-owned enterprises, Fannie and Freddie, and it was their job to take these individual mortgages that banks were originating that were maybe too risky or didn't have high enough of return as a single mortgage, package them all together in a portfolio of mortgages that had a higher return, higher risk, buy those mortgages from the banks originating them there, and then sell those mortgages on the private market such that the GSEs here were able to overcome the biggest constraint to originating mortgages is that they don't generate enough return. They could package them together. The rules for doing this were well regulated for the most part for Fannie and Freddie, and this actually led to a major increase in home ownership rates in the US. So financial crisis comes about. How does this happen? How is this linked to mortgages? So the US experiences this unprecedented increase in lending, so in credit extension, but that is not matched by an accompanying increase in income. So what you see happening over the course of the build-up to the crisis, debt goes up, income stays the same. So households' debt to income ratio is going up, right? So households are becoming increasingly indebted. A lot of that lending, turns out, is concentrated in areas of the United States where there are sort of a high share of subprime borrowers or borrowers with low credit scores. How can that happen? Well, that happens because we have these financial innovations called securitization that can package these really risky mortgages together in a way that lowers the risk and increases the return. And that leads to sort of these subprime areas, which would, without securitization, be areas that would not receive a lot of mortgage lending to suddenly receive lending. Now, the major thing that happens here is that in addition to Fannie and Freddie, a number of private institutions enter the market and start securitizing mortgages as well and selling them as private mortgage-backed securities. These private institutions are not following necessarily the same risk-averse rule set that Fannie and Freddie are following, and there is sort of a lot of financial mismanagement that happens with respect to how those mortgage-backed securities are created. So they look on paper safer than they are in reality. As sort of inflation starts to rise in the US, following this increase in lending, which leads to sort of an increase in spending because marginal propensities to consume are positive, the Fed responds by raising interest rates. In response to raising interest rates, house prices start to fall in the US. What starts happening now for many homeowners is that as house prices start to fall, at some point the value of the home that they're paying off is lower than the size of the mortgage that they have. And at that point, many homeowners go, I'm no longer going to pay this mortgage off because the home that I bought for 100,000 US is now only worth 70,000 US, but I'm still paying a mortgage worth 100,000 US. So instead of refinancing that, they simply hand in the keys at the bank and default on the home. That starts happening in increasing number. As that starts happening in increasing number, it drives prices down even more, which means more people start defaulting and you get a vicious cycle. All of the financial institutions that hold these mortgage-backed securities go bust because they're essentially holding securities that are worth nothing. That prompts a financial crisis. And in response to everything happening in financial markets, these highly indebted households who have just lost their homes, and we know all these negative effects with respect to losing one's home, cut their consumption as a result. That prompts a recession, and a financial crisis turns into a full-blown economic crisis. Right? And this is sort of just an example of this systemic impact that mortgages can have, because mortgages link households and they link banks and financial institutions as well, right? So they can transmit distress from households to banks. And when multiple financial institutions are holding these mortgages, they can transmit risk across those networks as well. But the thing I do want to mention here is that a lot of this started with a very well-intentioned policy motivation here, right? Just let's think of certain financial innovations that we could create to increase mortgage lending, which is going to increase home ownership rates. So as much as this is sort of a negative story about mortgages, I think it's important to also realize that this came from a sort of place of good intentions. Now, in the post-financial crisis world, certainly something we've experienced in South Africa, but I think this has been true in sort of a lot of countries in the global south, has been sort of a challenge with respect to mortgage access. So I think following the financial crisis, I think sort of mortgages have received a lot of attention from regulators. And this has led to sort of things like Basel III and amendments aimed at sort of making the banking system more resilient. But in many cases, that has actually led to a slowdown in mortgage provision. So what you're seeing here is numbers from the National Credit Regulator in South Africa, showing you the number of mortgages in South Africa originated over a 10-year period for different income groups. Now, this is a slightly misleading graph because the credit regulator does not adjust those income bands with inflation. So you're naturally, with time, just going to get people moving across the bands frustrating. We've asked them many times to fix that. But still, I want to draw your eye to 2024, which was last year, which is effectively for individuals earning under 15,000 South African rand a month. The financial system as a whole originated less than 1,500 mortgages. I'm going to say that again. For South Africans earning less than 15,000 rand a month, the financial services sector originated less than 1,500 mortgages in the whole of 2024. Right? And I think no matter what your view is on sort of how risky mortgages is and sort of a lot of the difficulties, I think in a country with the sort of adult population of South Africa, we need to hold our financial institutions to a higher standard here. That is not enough mortgage lending to address the housing backlog in South Africa. And it's clear that these banks are not averse to mortgage lending. They've given out 130,000 mortgages to people earning above 15,000 rand. Right, so it's clear that there's some underlying issue at play here. So why could that be the case? I think it's useful here to sort of think a bit about how a bank views a mortgage and essentially how a bank tries to make the decision whether or not to grant you the mortgage and then whether or not, or sort of what interest rate to give you on that mortgage. So banks will typically consider four things when they price a mortgage. The first is they'll do an affordability assessment. So let's look at your net income. Do you have sufficient net income to pay for the mortgage? In South Africa, there's a regulatory cap on that. So your monthly repayment on your mortgage is capped to a maximum of 30% of your gross income. So like a loan to income regulation, many other countries in the world have something similar. So can you afford it? Yes, no. Secondly, the bank thinks a bit about default and house price risk. So default, what is the probability of default? What's the likelihood you are going to default? And that's going to be a function of your credit score, your spending and saving patterns, the kind of job you have, the job security. Right, so the lower that probability of default is, the more likely you are to get a mortgage and the lower interest rate you're likely to get on that mortgage. But the bank is also thinking a bit about house price risk as well, right? Because the house is the bank's collateral. So if the bank is to buy a house and the bank expects that there's significant risk to that house deteriorating in value, or you've bought that house at a higher than market value for that house, the bank is taking on some risk as well. So after assessing that, and again, these aren't sequential by any nature, the bank also thinks a bit about the cost of funding. So effectively, you can think of the mortgage, and I want to speak about the cost of funding and the opportunity cost of funding here together. You can think of the mortgage department in a bank as one of many departments in a bank. And then this is how banks in South Africa work. There's a mortgage department, vehicle financing, business financing. And they're all effectively competing for a pool of deposits. And each of these departments need to go to the centralized pool and effectively sort of show that they are able to generate the highest return. And the bank is going to globally maximize across all of these lending categories. But different kinds of these sort of products are going to have different regulatory requirements as well. So with respect to mortgages, Basel III is going to require a bank to keep a certain amount of capital as safe capital in case the mortgage defaults. Different kinds of products that banks can offer are going to have different requirements as well. So there's this really complex system of sort of funding costs and opportunity costs that are at play. And sort of all of these factors are really sort of behind a bank thinking about whether or not they're looking to grant a mortgage and the interest rate they're going to add to that. So if you were to speak to a lot of the people in the mortgage lending space in South Africa and you were to ask them, why is it the case that you won't lend to, why there are so few mortgages in sort of the low income price segment, they're going to mention one of these five things, or in many cases all five. First, they're simply going to say, look, the default risk is too high. Right? So declining economic growth in a country like South Africa, the probability of defaults for these households are really, really high. There's no interest rate high enough we can charge that's going to cover for our expected risk here. So it's a sort of risk-based story. Secondly, the bank may cite some informational concerns. Right? So maybe these homes are being bought in fairly rural parts of the country, and in these parts of the country, the bank's property valuation models don't necessarily map that well to that area. There's not a lot of data for this neighborhood because transactions are very thin. So the bank may not have sufficient enough information to understand what the market value is of that property and what price trends are going to be. Security of tenure. So if someone's not spoken about this already, we have a major issue with respect to title deeds in South Africa. So many homes that people live in and have received from the state still don't have a title deed. So if you don't have a title deed, or you suspect there's maybe some errors with the title deed, a bank can't accept that as collateral. Fourth, and this is not what a bank will tell you, so this is a bit of an inference on my side, but I do think that there is reputational risk to foreclosures. Right? So if someone in a sort of informal settlement or a township, this is actually an example that someone gave, Ivan and I were at a conference last week, the Western Cape Property Developers Forum, and someone sort of gave this example that, look, we want to lend to an elderly woman in the township, but we know that if she defaults and we go in there and we try to repossess that home, that's not going to go well for us, right? So there's certain reputational concerns, but there may also be social factors that prevent the bank from being able to foreclose. So how should we be thinking about overcoming those? And then lastly, there are concerns about governance and municipal administration. A bank is holding this asset for 20 years, maybe even 30 years, while it waits for you to repay that. If a bank thinks that the underlying infrastructure around that home is at risk from deterioration or lack of maintenance, and that's going to have a negative spillover onto your property price, that's going to be an impediment. That's going to be an impediment as well. But importantly, this puts us at a bit of an impasse here, and I think we need, sort of out of all of the sections I've covered now, I think this probably represents one of the most sort of pertinent areas for us to be looking into and trying to solve. How do we get more mortgages to homeowners to address the housing gap? So I think I'm still good on time here, so I'm just going to close off quickly and then we can head into some Q&A. So in conclusion, I hope I've made the case over the course of these slides why I think housing deserves your attention, but also deserves serious economic research. So housing is not just this roof over our heads, but it's a central mechanism through which things like inequality, macroeconomic risk, and financial stability are going to propagate. And housing has this multi-dimensional sort of feature. So you could be interested in the consumption side, you could be interested in the asset side, the liability side, you could be interested in all three. It certainly is a very sort of fun thing to study. It's the largest expenditure item for most households, and that has links to household well-being. As an asset, it's the dominant form of wealth, and we've shown that this sort of drives wealth inequality. And as a liability, mortgages sort of present a systemic risk in that they link households and banks, but there are also major opportunities here to think about how we could reform the mortgage market to provide better access to housing as well. And if you think about housing, it's really deeply embedded in sort of every sort of sphere of public policy. When we speak about housing, it could as much be speaking about zoning regulation as it could be credit or macro-prudential regulation as well. So maybe then just to sort of end off here, sort of taking a specific eye to South Africa, and which is the area where sort of all my work is, but sort of I think a lot of this is true in Africa as well. Where is sort of my thinking, at least over the next few years, and some stuff I'd like to be working on, and I sort of hope this resonates with some people in the room. On housing and inequality, we really need to get a better grasp, even just at a descriptive level, of the role housing plays with respect to wealth inequality in South Africa and in Africa. So this is primarily a measurement problem. And then we need to try to understand what are the differential returns to housing that people are making. And are those differential returns, which may be correlated with things like education, which may be correlated with socioeconomic status, are those differential returns increasing or exacerbating wealth inequality in the country? Thinking about mortgage markets, again, how do we deepen and extend mortgage markets? And this is sort of the second point here I think is a really exciting one, is what is the role of fintech and sort of alternative credit in trying to sort of shake up and shape sort of new mortgage markets here? I think that there's high returns to sort of working in this area of sort of mortgage lending and fintech. And then I think, as always, we need a lot more work on data and methods, right? You can only try to study and understand things that you can measure, and sort of things are certainly better now than they were 10 years ago, but we need sort of all of you in the room working to generate better geospatial data, working with house price authorities to create house price indices and create them at the sort of levels of disaggregation that we need for them to be useful. We need sort of access to credit and mortgage registry data as well. And then finally, which is something I know Nick will touch on tomorrow, there's certainly a growing space for the use of structural models in this space as well. So yeah, thank you very much. That's me. Any questions?
Okay, thank you very much. This is also very inspiring. I would like to know your experience here in South Africa, how these mortgage banks secure long-term finance for housing for 20 years and above. Specifically, when you consider the case of Ethiopia, there were mortgage banks, but later they were closed because of lack of long-term finance, and they were converted to ordinary commercial banks. Yeah, I need to know the experience in South Africa. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. That's actually a really interesting one. So in South Africa, we don't really have this idea of a mortgage bank. Well, we technically have one, SA Home Loans, but they're a bit of an anomaly. So sort of mortgages exist within sort of a single bank, business lending, sort of, it's all within, we've got 4 major banks, 5 now in the country, 4 of which provide mortgages. So the question was sort of here, how are those banks funding these mortgages, or how are they attracting funding? And this is where South Africa is actually an anomaly globally. So we primarily fund in South Africa mortgages, and have historically funded mortgages with short-term deposits. And that sounds a bit weird. So historically, before the introduction of Basel III, there was actually no requirement for how banks chose to pair up the nature of the funds that they have and the sort of types of loans that they were originating, right? So a bank can take a deposit, right? And that deposit, they're paying no interest on that, but in return for that, you can pull that deposit at any time. Or the bank could have longer term funding, so let's say a 1 or 2 year term deposit, where the bank pays you an interest rate, but the bank knows that for 2 years you can't pull this money out. So the bank knows if they're going to lend that out, they've got 2 years to effectively make sure that money returns back to you when you come to take that money out as a deposit. Now, one of the big issues in the financial crisis were that in many jurisdictions, the Bank of International Settlements found out that a lot of banks would fund long-term mortgages using short-term deposits. And that obviously creates a concern, because if all of your depositors are suddenly going to show up and ask for their money back, but you've tied the repayment of that money to this 20-year mortgage product, you may not be able to actually meet the demand of these depositors showing up. So in return, sort of to address this, the Basel III regulation did 2 things. They introduced something called the NSFR, the Net Stable Funding Ratio, and the LCR, the Liquidity Coverage Ratio. And effectively, what the sort of combination of those 2 things does is it sort of requires banks to now, for sort of long-term loans, fund them using long-term sources of funding. So if you want to give it a 20-year mortgage, you need to find a really long-term source of funding, which is obviously really expensive because you need to pay a high interest rate on that. So if any of you go to your bank apps and look at the investment options, the longer the length of the sort of withdrawal period, the higher interest the bank's actually going to pay you. So obviously, if you're funding with longer-term, more expensive funding, but the mortgage interest rates are staying the same, suddenly mortgages become less profitable for banks. Now, in most countries, banks were typically already funding mortgages with long-term funding. South Africa is an anomaly in that we effectively fund everything out of short-term deposits. So the interbank markets in South Africa are highly illiquid, which means that effectively all bank lending gets funded by short-term deposits. So this now creates a problem for the banks in South Africa, because now suddenly the Bank of International Settlements tells you, you either need to keep the short-term funding base and stop giving out mortgages, or you need to increase your sort of holding of more expensive long-term funding and that's going to allow you to give out mortgages. And what you actually see happens when you look at the sort of regulatory reporting of these banks is that they effectively just hold enough long-term funding that they need to be able to extend the amount of mortgages. So they try to meet the mortgage demand. And in many cases, a lot of sort of people anecdotally have spoken about the idea that mortgages are probably unprofitable in South Africa because the interest rates banks can charge on them relative to the returns banks are having to pay on the funding just don't make sense. And banks in South Africa have not sort of chosen to sort of reallocate more. So I think a large part of this sort of like slowdown in funding is a sort of unintentional impact of sort of this macroprudential regulation called Basel III, which made the financial sector safer. And it highlights, I think, a big critique we often have about sort of Bretton Woods style global policy being applied to a context like South Africa, where you sort of have this copy-paste idea, where in South Africa, we certainly now have a really stable financial sector that's highly capitalized, that's highly liquid, but does that potentially come at the cost of lower mortgages, given the sort of structure of the underlying funding base of banks in South Africa? So we certainly need more of a discussion around this issue of how banks are funding mortgages, because I think sort of unless we solve that, we're probably still going to be living in this world of really low mortgage extension.
Just to follow up on that point, when you say lower mortgages, is there more credit rationing or are the interest rates higher?
Yeah, so I had a student last year actually look at this, and there isn't much of an effect on the intensive margin on the interest rates as well. So a lot of this really just happens on the extensive margin. So in many cases, I mean, if you speak to some of the people in the space, they'd often tout this idea that mortgages are loss leaders. So we'll give you the mortgage, we'll make a loss on a mortgage, but what banks will do these days is you'll go to them and they'll go, we'll give you a lower interest rate if you move all of your accounts over. So they'll take the hit on the mortgage, but then move your family's accounts over, move your investment accounts over in return for this lower interest rate. And that's sort of where they're able to make the returns there. But again, that's anecdotal, but.
Thanks. Yeah, just great presentation. Just want to say that. The mortgage recourse. So that was a surprise to me, and I have a mortgage, which is worrying. But where is that? Why? How is that? What is that based? What jurisprudence is it? What other countries have it, and how much is it? Are there any studies on how much it's acting in the debt sort of trap that you mentioned earlier in the presentation?
So yeah, it's something that's the case in South Africa. What makes South Africa even worse is, so I have a paper on this. It appears that South Africa may be either the only or like one or two or three countries in the world where you sort of have this recourse environment, but the home foreclosures where the banks sell these things happen without reserve prices. So the sort of paper I have studies this and find these massive discounts, but there's one that sort of is in the literature where someone has a home worth 100,000 rand with outstanding debt of like 10,000 that the bank sells for like one rand. So it's especially punitive in South Africa because we have this no reserve price and recourse. That's changed in 2018. So there's actually a really big policy to introduce reserve prices that have a really nice design because they stagger them in different parts of the country. That's a paper that I'm working on at the moment to sort of see what impact changing sort of this mortgage, this consumer protection legislation has. But yeah, South Africa, there are certain states in the US, I'm not sure how many, but there are states in the US that have it. There are some countries in Europe too. But yeah, it is an especially punitive type of regulation, especially in a context like South Africa where you don't have this protection via a reserve price. If you have a reserve price and the reserve price can be set at the value of outstanding debt, no problem, right? But when you don't have reserve prices, it creates a sort of double-edged sword. Hi, Iris.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. I have two related questions. Mm-hmm. The first question is that you mentioned the issue of spatial mismatch, the disconnect between places of residence and jobs. So the big critique to RDP and BNG was that those subsidized development are quite far away from jobs. And I was wondering, is over the past 30 years, you've seen some evolution actually. Are we building closer to jobs or not? That's the first question. And then the other question, which is related to that, is that in order to address spatial mismatch, there are three ways to go. Either you bring people to jobs, that is, you build houses closer to the jobs, you bring jobs to people, which means that you have more jobs in the townships, or you better connect people and jobs, that is transport. So first question is whether you see some evolution on the first front, and the second question is what about the two other fronts? Has there been some improvement in terms of connecting people to jobs or in terms of having more jobs in the townships?
Okay, thanks, Harris. On your first question about sort of this, whether or not we've seen an evolution on this and evolution in the response, it actually makes me think of a paper of yours, the paper on backyarding. So I think we sort of saw this idea that sort of government is providing houses far away from economic opportunity, and the question was, do we see a sort of evolution in sort of the way housing is being provided? I think that there's been an evolution, but the evolution has sort of been a response from the people being affected by these policies, and you see it in two ways. One is this phenomenon of backyarding. So Harris has a paper on this, which is a very nice one in Cape Town, but effectively what you see happening is an increasing sort of these informal residential structures built on sort of excess sort of land available on plots close to the city start happening. So these RDP government homes are typically a small home provided on a much bigger plot of land, right? So it's theory that it maybe leads to an overconsumption of land supply, and sort of how many of households have responded to that is by starting to build informal structures in this sort of like excess area of land and start renting them out. And if you take a look at like aerial photographs of Cape Town and many other parts of the country, Harris's paper has a really interesting set of photos that show this. You can just see this increasing like informal densification. So I think sort of that's the sort of one area where it's responded, but I think there's also been a major response with respect to property developers building what we call sort of small scale rental units in these areas that are slightly closer to the city. So it's taking a small plot of land, providing financing to that homeowner to be able to sort of densify. And those have arguably been sort of two interventions that have come from people being affected as opposed to sort of policy. And I think we're sort of in this position now where, you know, these mechanisms seem to be working, but now they're sort of arguably being constrained by a lack of infrastructure provision, electricity and water by the government. So I think sort of on that evolution, we've seen the evolution happen. It's not necessarily come from policymakers, but I think we need to embrace that sort of informal response and figure out sort of how we can think of that informality not as sort of a negative, but try to put pressure on the state to provide better support for that sort of endogenous densification.
Just attracting jobs to the township?
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I think on attracting jobs to the townships, there's sort of been this this paper that came in a few years ago about the Kasi economy in South Africa, so like the township economy and sort of how that is exploding. And I think if you look at any measure of sort of economic activity within informal areas in the country, you see that the numbers are going up, right? It's just the case that we probably don't see that in official numbers or statistics, because sort of a lot of that is not necessarily formally recorded. I still think that there's probably too much money in that township economy leaving the township. In terms of sort of like what we need more is sort of more small enterprise coming into the township. So you sort of create that circular economy within the township. But I think for the most part, we sort of still have a very monocentric city, which I think probably means for the medium term, trying to address transport and sort of making, or at least trying to diversify the number of employment hubs we have away from one CBD to maybe 3 or 4 CBDs with better access point is going to be probably the solution that gives us greater bang for the buck. Okay. I'm also happy to continue this discussion afterwards. I don't want to keep anyone away from a cold beer.
Okay, thank you. I am Mudu from Bahar University, Ethiopia. I have one question. There is market failure in the housing sector. Consequently, the poor, especially the housing market, doesn't provide housing to the poor, to the urban poor. So, do you think that government intervention would solve this problem?
Yeah, 100%. So, I mean, I think sort of if you look at the construction costs to actually build, you'll find that sort of it's not really feasible to be able to sort of incur the construction cost and sort of set the price for housing at a price that's going to be accessible, right? So there are sort of major sort of pressures on the cost side. So I do think that there is a space for state-sponsored housing. It's something we've done in South Africa. What I think we've done poorly is we've created the houses, but we've not given the houses the security, which means that they can become part of the formal property market. So we have this sort of set of 3 million homes, of which only a small percentage have title deeds, right? Which means that for the percentage that don't have title deeds, those houses can't transact through the system. So I think government does have a role to play in providing those houses, but then secondly, there's also an important role to play ensuring that those houses are bankable, those houses are transactable, and that requires sort of safety of tenure.
Thank you for the presentation. I know your research mostly focuses on mortgages or home ownership, but I was just wondering if you have any thoughts of government intervention in rental markets or how to like reduce frictions there. Because if you look, so one of the comments made in your presentation was that home ownership increases wealth. But if you look at the data out of Cape Town in South Africa, at least, it hasn't kept it up in real terms, right, at all. So it's not necessarily increasing mortgages or access to buying or property ownership doesn't necessarily result in wealth accumulation. So that's my first question. My second, and sort of going on the same one, is for other parts of Africa, I think and you spoke a bit about like mortgage refinance companies and how we finance mortgages. It's also like quite risky, right? For government to spend its resources to actually increase the depth of the mortgage market, because the markets are so shallow, considering like the percentage of formal jobs. And I think when you look at the World Bank's work, like in Tanzania or Nigeria, it's sort of a subsidization of sort of like upper income households more than anything, than actually creating a sustainable mortgage market. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point about rental markets. If you sort of think about that moving to opportunity project in the US, that was effectively a housing voucher that went to rental housing as well. So, I mean, Ivan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we've got any experience in South Africa with housing vouchers for the rental market. No.
Big issue about the.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a context of demand-side subsidies. Are they happening in Cape Town or are they happening in the rest of the country as well? And what's the land supply looking like? But so certainly, I mean, I think in Cape Town, I'm hesitant to want to think a lot about demand side, just given the pressures on affordability and given the like lackluster approach to densification and increasing land supply in the city. So sort of there, I think it's really important. But sort of in the rest of the country, I think one of the big tragedies of the last 10 to 20 years has been the poor take-up of the FLISP in South Africa. So for those of you that don't know, outside of receiving an RDP home, there's another demand-side intervention that the government has in South Africa called FLISP, which is effectively a subsidy that the government provides you if your income is just above the threshold, which means you don't qualify for state-sponsored housing. And how this effectively works is for a certain level of income, the government gives you a subsidy, but the government actually pays that subsidy directly to the bank. So if you have a 1 million rand loan, the government will pay the subsidy directly to the bank, and then you will be paying a repayment on a loan of 700,000 and not a million. But if you look at the number of FLISPs that have been extended, they're actually strikingly low, and I unfortunately don't have the figure, but I think the FLISPs largely apply to people earning around 7,500 rand or something, 10,000 rand and below. When you compare the number of FLISPs with the number of mortgages originated in the income segment that FLISP applies to, you see that there are more mortgages originated for people that are eligible for FLISPs than there are actual FLISPs originated. So it's clear that there are people who would be eligible for FLISPs that simply aren't getting them. And I think that that's a real tragedy, and it's something I know that sort of local governments have acknowledged, but I think we do have one very good demand-side intervention, the FLISP, but I think that there are a myriad of implementation issues there that need to be fixed. And I think that if we can fix that, I think the FLISP is a crucially needed intervention, specifically in that like gap or that missing middle of the housing market. Okay, thanks everyone.